What would you say is the most misused verse in the Bible? There's over 31,000 verses in both the Old and New Testaments. And if you had to pick one and say it was the most misused verse in all the Bible, what would it be? This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. And I haven't done a video in a few days. I've been very, very busy and not been able to do the videos like I like to do. So we're going to do another one today on this idea of the most misused verse in the Bible. And so I'm going to suggest that the most misused verse in all the Bible is Romans chapter 3 and verse 23. And I hope you'll hang around and study with me just for a few minutes. Most people could probably quote Romans 3:23. The Bible says, "Therefore all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." I've heard that verse used in sermons and lectures, written in articles talking about the fact that everybody's a sinner, nobody's perfect. And specifically, I've heard that verse a lot over the years used in terms and applied to Christians. No Christian's perfect. So let's do a couple things here. First of all, let's agree nobody is perfect. We understand that. But second of all, we need to understand the context in which Paul's writing this. Because here's what happens a lot of times with Romans chapter 3 and verse 23. That one verse is quoted, and then the larger context of what's going on here is ignored. And I've been doing a lot with context lately. Last Thursday night, I was on GBN Live with BJ Clark and Mike Hickson, and we talked about the importance of biblical context. I wrote an article recently for Fulton County Gospel News, and the title of that article is "Don't Proof Text" or "The Problem of Proof Texting." I don't remember the exact title. If you go to our website, mammothspringchurchofchrist.com, you can pull up that, you can pull up any edition of Fulton County Gospel News, but that was I believe the September-October edition of the paper of 2019. But anyway, what happens with Romans 3:23, like I said, is just that one verse is quoted and the larger context is ignored. And so let's think about this for just a minute. What exactly is going on here? You can't start in Romans 3 and verse 23 to prove the point that all men have sinned. Again, we know that nobody's perfect. We know that nobody is sinlessly perfect. However, something unique is going on here in the book of Romans. The book of Romans is a unique book throughout the New Testament, and it's probably one of the most misused books in the New Testament too. To teach premillennialism, to teach salvation by faith alone, it's been misused in a lot of ways. I think one great example of how Romans has been misused is from Martin Luther, the Reformer, when he translated the Bible into his language in Romans 3 and verse 28, where the Bible says there, let me just read it here. "Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law." Well, when Martin Luther, who had broken away from Catholicism, translated Romans, he translated Romans 3:28 like this: "Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith alone, apart from the deeds of the law." So he took liberty to add a word that's not there. So the book of Romans has been understood and used to teach things that are not true for a long time. But what's going on here in the early chapters of Romans is Paul is showing that everybody does need the gospel. But what he's doing very specifically in chapter 1, he addresses the fact that the Gentiles needed the gospel. And of course, a Gentile that's anybody who is outside of the Mosaic covenant. This is a person who is, when you see this person in the Old Testament, they're often called a stranger or a foreigner, or sometimes the Old Testament will say something to the Jewish people, "one who sojourns among you." Well, that's talking about a Gentile. So at the end of Romans chapter 1, really beginning in about verse 18 down through verse 32, Paul's discussing the problem of sin among the Gentiles. But then when he gets to chapter 2, he turns his attention to the Jewish people. And he starts out by saying, "Therefore you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge. For in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself." And he goes on throughout that entire chapter showing that just as the Gentiles were in sin and needed the gospel, chapter 1, chapter 2, so the Jews. But then when you get to chapter 3, he points out, well, the Jewish people had an advantage. over the Gentiles because they had been entrusted with the oracles of God, and that's a reference to the written scriptures. You can go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 4, for example. The first several verses talk about the fact that God had given the Jews his covenant, and of course they broke that covenant. They weren't faithful to it. So chapter 3 is his conclusion that both Jew and Gentile, everybody under that old covenant, was guilty of sin and in need of the gospel. So what happens with Romans 3:23 today, as I've already said, is that, again, I've heard it and I'm sure you've heard it too. A preacher will take that verse, we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God, and he'll apply that to Christians. That's not what Paul's talking about, though. That's not what that verse is dealing with. And the reason we know that's the case is because we have to go back up further into the passage. Just for example, Romans chapter 3 and verse 9, it says, "What then are we, Jews," Paul's writing, he was a Jew, "are we better than they, the Gentiles? Not at all, for we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin." That's his premise. That's his argument that he's making. Well, how is he going to prove that that's the case? That is the fact? Well, Romans 3, beginning in verse 10, discusses that. He says, "As it is written." So he says, all are under sin. Now I'm going to show you from the Old Testament. So here's what I want us to do. I've got two Bibles out here, and I'm going to show you where he is going to prove that both Jew and Gentile are under sin, and that he's not talking to Christians who struggle with sin. There are other passages of the Bible that talk about that. Romans 3 doesn't. So he says in Romans 3:10, "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one." And again, I've heard that verse. I'm turning in my other Bible here to show you where it is in the Old Testament. I've heard even that verse, Romans chapter 3 and verse 10, used and applied to Christians. Well, none of us are righteous. Nobody's righteous. The problem with that is other verses tell us that we are, that we can be. Just for example, Acts 10:35, "Whoever fears God and works righteousness is accepted with him." We can be righteous. We are righteous when we are in Christ and when we're walking in the light. To be righteous simply means that we're doing what is right. We're doing what is lawful in God's eyes. So here in Romans 3:10, Paul says, "There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God. They are all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. There is none who does good, no, not one." And again, this is all said in the context of Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." But what is Paul quoting here? Because as he says, we've concluded, verse 9, that all are under sin, as it is written. The interesting thing to do is to go back into the Old Testament and to see what he's quoting. So looking at my other Bible here, Romans 3 verses 10, 11, and 12 are a direct quote from Psalm chapter 14. You know what Psalm chapter 14 starts out by saying? "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Now, does that describe a Christian? A fool? One who says there is no God? Well, of course not. Let's see here. Psalm 14 verse 3, "They are all gone aside. They are all together become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one." Who was the psalmist talking about, though? The psalmist was talking about the fool who says there is no God. All Paul is doing in Romans 3 is going to the scriptures, the Old Testament, to show that everybody needed the gospel, both Jews and Gentiles. Again, he's not talking to Christians who are struggling with sin in Romans chapter 3. He then says in verse 13, "Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they practice deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips." So what's he quoting in Romans chapter 3 and verse 13? Well, that's from Psalm chapter 5 and verse 9. And it says, "There is no faithfulness in their mouth. That their inward part is very wicked. Their throat is an open tomb. They flatter with their tongue. Destroy them, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels." Who's he talking about there? The psalmist, again, he's not talking about Christians. You have to go back to Psalm 5 and verse 5. "The foolish shall not stand in thy sight. Thou hatest all the workers of iniquity." So when you look at Romans 3:13, that's the context that's the passage that Paul's using, and that's the context in which it was written. We could go on down. Romans 3:14, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Well, that's a quote from Psalm chapter 10. And the specified audience there that David was addressing was the wicked man. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Romans 3:15. Well, that's a quote of Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 16, and it's specifically talking about the sinner. And on and on. Verse 16, destruction and misery. And so just think about this for just a minute with me. If Romans 3:23 is talking about Christians, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, then all of these verses are talking about Christians. And see how much sense that makes. Is Paul talking to Christians here? There's none righteous, no, not one. There's none who understands. There's none who seeks after God. They've all turned aside. They've all together become unprofitable. There's none who does good, no, not one. Their throat is no, and on we could go. Verse 18, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Again, that is not describing a Christian. What Paul is doing in Romans chapter 3 is he is discussing the Jews and the Gentiles' condition before the cross. And just another way to show that, to prove that that's the case, you can look at Romans 3 verses 19 and 20. Listen to what he says. After he's quoted all those Old Testament passages, he says this, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law that every mouth may be stopped. So he's just been quoting the law, and he's talking about those Jews and Gentiles who lived in that time, who lived before the cross, that their mouths may be stopped, and all the world may be guilty before God. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin. So it's, to me, it's very clear when you, not only when you read the background, the Old Testament context of Romans 3 verses 10 through 18. Maybe you have a concordance, or like in my Bible here, I've got a center column reference, and where each verse here quotes an Old Testament passage, it cross-references it. You can go back and look in whatever it is, Psalm 14 or Psalm 5 or Proverbs 1, and you can read the original context. So not only do you have that, but then you have what he says in verses 19 and 20 here. Whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. You and I are not under the law today. We're not under the jurisdiction of the law of Moses. That law was nailed to the cross. It was taken out of the way. And he's going to make that point here. And so you go on down to Romans 3 and verse 21. He does all this from the Old Testament. Romans 3 verses 9 through 18. And the first word of verse 21 is but. And that's an important word in your New Testament. Just by way of example, read Matthew chapter 5. How many times does Jesus say there in the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it has been said, but I say to you. This is a word in the Greek language that shows a contrast. So here's where we have what we have here. Here's what we have now. So Romans 3, 9 through 19, or 9 through 20 really, here's what we have under the old law. But now, okay, now we're talking the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed. Well, the righteousness of God has been revealed today through the gospel. And that's told to us in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Nobody can be made just by the old law. And Paul says that in Galatians 2 and verse 16. It's very clear. But the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So the law and the Old Testament prophets spoke of this. Even the righteousness of faith, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe. That's important. And then he says this, for there is no difference. That's the end of Romans 3:22. If you want to be saved, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, he's making the point, you have to be saved in the same way. There's no way of salvation for one group of people and a different way for another group. And then we have what I call the most misused verse in the Bible, Romans 3:23. And the English reads a little differently than the Greek actually reads here. It says in the English language, for all have sinned. And we take that to mean, well, that's all of us. All of us have sinned. That's not what Paul says. Again, you have to keep in mind the historical context, his use of the Old Testament, beginning in verse 10. The Greek there in Romans 3:23 is actually written in the simple past tense, the aorist tense. And what he says literally is, for all sinned and have fallen short of the glory of God. Well, if you're trying to be justified by the law, you're falling short of the glory of God. Jews and Gentiles all sinned, absolutely. But now we can be free from that in the new covenant. And he goes on, so verse 24, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith. An interesting thing to note here, and I've got this marked in the margin of my Bible, in verse 25, whom God set forth as a propitiation by blood through, the Greek language has the definite article the, through the faith. That's talking about the gospel. That's not talking about my personal faith or my personal belief or your personal belief. We are justified freely by his grace through the faith, through the gospel, to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance, God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. Okay? That's Romans 3:10 through 18. God passed over that, and now we've come to the new covenant, and we can have justification, we can have righteousness in full under that law, to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So, to me, Romans 3:23 is a prime example of the danger of proof texting, because like I said in the beginning of the video, I've heard for years and years and years Romans 3:23 used and applied talking to Christians about their sin. That is not what Paul's talking about there. Respect the context. Take the time to dig into it, to see what he's talking about, to whom he is speaking, why he is writing this. You have to ask all those questions when you're discussing any text of the Bible, any particular passage of the Bible. So those are just a few thoughts that I had today that I wanted to share with you. We're saved through the gospel. Again, I mentioned this earlier, Galatians 2:16, for by the law shall no flesh be justified. We can't go back under that law of Moses. We can't be saved by keeping the Ten Commandments. We can only be saved through the faith, through the gospel of Christ. And that's Romans 1:16 and 17. In fact, there in Romans 1:16 it says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. So he tells us there in Romans 1:16 that it's the gospel that saves, but then he says in verse 17, therein is the righteousness of God revealed. If you want to know how to be right with God, you have to be in the gospel. You have to know what the new covenant of Christ said. You're not going to find it under the old law. The Old Testament's great. It's written for our learning, and there are just a multitude of examples that we can draw from under the Old Testament, but you can't be saved by it. So, in my opinion, and that's all it is, the most misused verse in the Bible is Romans 3:23. Keep it in its context, understand what it's saying, and like I said a minute ago, take the time to dig a little bit deeper than just taking a casual look at a passage that maybe it says something you think it says, maybe it doesn't. Look a little deeper. Appreciate you tuning in. I've got several on the live stream right now. Thanks for watching. Check out a couple things on Facebook. The page nearchurches.com, a lot of good content on there. And then also the private group, ask to join if you're not already a member. We Talk Truth. It's a great group with a lot of great discussion in relation to God's Word. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.